This communication addresses the issue of cooperation between universities and cultural identity in a period of pandemics, with a special concern about the role of leaders under the risk of all of us becoming more and more equal. It is divided in 5 parts. In the first part, I will introduce universities, their mission and uncertainty, how we face uncertainty. We address the need for a better understanding of the role of academic leaders under the current transition affecting societies and cultures. As we witnessed universities leaving the traditional ivory tower model, universities become gradually service providers. We provide essentially 3 types of service to society. First of all, we generate knowledge. Second of all, we discuss the best possible ways of sharing knowledge through society. And finally, and very importantly, we generate knowledge-based education. Now, the current pandemics led universities to do a number of things. Among those things, we developed a number of online learning best practices. The main implication of those online learning best practices and the dissemination of those practices is a radical change in the way personal relations are developed within each of our campuses. This clearly affects one's perception of the kind of services that universities provide to society. The idea of following best practices among all of us to overcome the kind of difficulties that we all felt in the past couple of years makes all the sense. Is the idea of synergy. I mean, if you know how to do it, why should I reinvent the wheel, right? However, we have to notice something that's very important, and sometimes it's overlooked. We are using the same technologies to serve quite different realities. The way technology is used should actually be considered and be adapted to the different cultures and to the different societies that each of one are serving. At the same time, this kind of standardization facilitates the comparison between institutions. That is typically made through the ranking mechanisms. So in some sense, this standardization is reinforcing the mechanism of the rankings. But at the same time, it's curious to understand that this kind of development fires back in our organizational culture. The organizational culture of the universities is affected by that, as we have all witnessed in this past couple of years. Our main concern regarding the challenges of the leadership in modern times at universities, it's to make sure that institutions, universities in general, do not lose their intrinsic character as defined and molded throughout time by the societies and cultures in which we are embedded. And that in spite of these sort of forced conversions in technology and rankings. The part 2 of our presentation is about the pandemics and how these specific circumstances affected us. In order to do that, we first must go back to the role of universities. And what are we? Universities, throughout time, throughout the centuries, they base their reputation on essentially tradition, the relevance of their network of alumni, present and past. Some universities are proud in their webpage of the number of saints that actually were alumni of their institution. But also, and more significantly, it's based on the long-term contribution of their knowledge generation to society. how the knowledge generated by that university and that institution actually helped society to develop. The traditional role of universities is based historically on social elitism. Only an elite would be admitted to study and to contribute. It is also characterized by a strong organizational inertia. And that means a big mass, a difficulty to move. That's what inertia is about. And that is translated into a reluctance to implement changes in the organization that may be looked as radical. Those radical changes and social transformation, specifically in modern times after World War II in the 20th century, led universities in the West in the 50s to understand and to recognize the dominant role of knowledge, in particular of technology. This is particularly significant and relevant in the areas of STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, and also in the area of management, with the appearance of the first relevant MBA programs. So, understanding the impact of technology in the war, think about it, and the way to manage is important. It also recognizes the importance to make it more democratic, the access to the knowledge center. And that was done by creating a lot of polytechnicals that would become later on young universities. It also led to an increase in the number of young universities across the world. To have an idea, currently around 100 to 200 new universities per year are created worldwide. We have about 30,000 universities worldwide. Most of them are young universities. If you go and look for universities that are more than 600 years old, you'll find about 20, no more than 20. But in the 20th century, modern universities became needed to better understand the need to adapt to changes as required to be resilient in their mission. They need to develop the capacity to adjust to changes in society as they provide the adequate services that society required given all the changes that we're going through. And they need to provide flexibility in the way they operate so as to guarantee that the social expectations under these more recent developments are met. The pandemics is just the most recent example of such radical change, just like World War II was also an example of radical change in society. And that would affect the academic system globally. So with the pandemics, what happens is that we have no longer the possibility of face-to-face interaction. This is not possible due to the risk of contagion. We have to reduce our habits of traveling. I will no longer travel to China for 2 days and fly back. Whenever I travel to China, I want to spend at least a full week enjoying. Okay? We have become, under these online communication, more and more conscious of the time difference among partners. It's not simply that we can set a Zoom. We have to make a careful adjustment of our agendas because of time zones. And the main concern, of course, is always, and it will always be, communication under our activities. And it's true for education, it's true for research, and it's true for what we're doing here, academic development. Both internally, within the universities and institutions, as well as externally, and most remarkably, when we consider international cooperation. The solution for an effective communication under the presence of these pandemics was, obviously, technological, and namely to develop online communication mechanisms. So the use of internet-based technology was required in order to implement that kind of activity, to overcome those gaps, right? And do remember that distance learning has been tried before in several advanced universities as an experiment, trying to see how does it work if we teach and if we learn online. So all the required technology was already available. But it was not used as extensively as it should for one particular reason: people and their aversion to technology. People like to teach as they were taught. And in order to ask people to teach in a different way, you need to train them. Technology aversion actually reflects one of the most critical and rooted characteristics of traditional universities: the reluctance to change procedures, to change the way we operate. And this has several implications. And this is part 3 of our presentation. I'll discuss the implications of this online learning paradigm. The use of this kind of technology that is internet-based has several implications. I will point out 4 of them. The first is whether technology is available or to what extent it is available. Well, first of all, that technology depends on internet. So it's not simply internet, it's infrastructure for the internet. It's the speed of internet, the quality of the connection, and the availability. Also, this technology requires available platforms that may come at a cost. I'm talking about Zoom, Teams, and other similar platforms. Who supplies such technologies? And most importantly, at what cost? Under what kind of social, financial, and technological constraints? These are all things that we have to think about. And if we have them all available in the same way, we have to think, what kind of standardization is that implying for us? The implication also includes a second point: how such communication mechanisms affect the way we relate to each other. I'm talking about personal relations like the students and their instructor, the PhD student and his or her advisor, researchers within a research group, or the organizational hierarchy. How does a boss communicate with his or her staff? This is also strongly dependent on culture and society, of course. But more importantly, is potentially a changing mechanism for cultures and societies. We are used to interact in a certain way. That's part of what characterizes our culture. If we change that, we are potentially changing the way our culture develops itself. The other thing is how incentives previously defined no longer work in the same way. For instance, if before the pandemics you get a premium for being in your office all the time, how does that affect your behavior if you depend on that premium? Probably not. Commitment regarding the academic learning and research goals and delivery. These may all change due to the fact that we cannot interact face to face. And the fact that individual reactions and interests may be quite diverted due to relationship changes. People are more and more at home. They are busy with different things that they didn't used to do when they could interact socially in the open air. A third additional implication is the training of the users of this new technology. We have to train students. We have to train instructors, and that's not an easy one. We have to train researchers, and we have to train administrative staff. And this includes how to make it, at the beginning, friendly for the users, so that if you face it as friendly, then you can evolve to a more professional use of technology and more proficient. This is clearly a very gradual process that implies change, personal change, and social change. How to overcome technology aversion due to the imperative need. So you have to develop some sort of process where people, either they adapt to the new technological mode or they will perish in the process. They won't be useful to the organization. And how to adapt career development on that specific basis. Something to be considered now that we all have changed our way of doing things. Finally, I will consider a fourth implication. And that one is adapting the university service to the new social relations that will emerge from the use of these new kind of technology. So by using this new kind of technology, the first thing that you have to understand is that the needs from society and individuals will change. We have to adjust the methods that we use in research and education to fit the new needs. We have to adapt the mechanism response that universities provide to society. We have to adapt that to the new technological conditions. This should be true at the three different levels of the services that we provide. And I will remind you of which are those. First, knowledge generation. Second, knowledge-based education. And third, knowledge sharing. Those are the three essential missions that are reflected in the service that society requires from universities nowadays. Once we understand these implications, we are now in conditions to go for the fourth part. And what is this about? It's about the sources of tension between standardization, culture, and cooperation. So think about it carefully. All this development based on technology has been standardized. We all use the same online communication tools. That doesn't matter if we are in Europe or in China. And still, the implications described above, they depend on our social organization. And they depend on our cultural environment. And I will go back to the points that are the main implications that I described before to analyze them under the tensions that they generate. The first is to what extent technology is available. The second is how online communication mechanisms may affect the way people and individuals relate to each other. The third is how should we consider to train users regarding the new technology and overcome their natural resistance to change. And finally, it's given those technologies and the change in society, how should we adapt the services provided by universities to the new emerging social relations and to the new needs revealed by society? These four things will have different impact and possibly different efficiency if you consider their impact in Europe and in China. As our societies reflect different forms of culture and different ways of seeing these implications. Actually, to be honest, we don't need to compare it with China. In Europe, it varies from country to country. Okay? I can only imagine how the impact in China, these different four impacts in China, would be considered differently from what we face in Europe. The fact is that universities serve society. That is quite true. But the societies each of us serve are quite different. They induce different behavior in individuals, but also induce quite different expectations in each of our countries and in each of our continents. The knowledge generation agenda in each country may follow quite different incentive schemes. The knowledge-based education provided in each of our countries, in each of our institutions, are leveraged on quite distinct educational systems. And the knowledge sharing strategy that each one of us try to follow is actually quite competitive. And they will reflect the competitiveness for technology across different countries. What is unavoidable is that there are forces trying to standardize higher education. And these forces are all around. They are reflected, as we were describing above, in the communication technology, and specifically in what we have experienced in the online communication. But not only that, we cannot forget the role, the very important role that the ranking system has, modeling and transforming our view of universities. We have similarly accreditation mechanisms that are very much enrooted in those ranking mechanisms. And we are constrained in various different ways by fundraising and different models for fundraising. If you want to think about it, the advantage of standardization is pretty obvious. It makes all of us more comparable, and that is true in the paper. The disadvantage, however, is also pretty obvious, because we are not directly comparable, as we, surprisingly enough, do not live in the paper, and we face distinct realities and ways of viewing the world. The challenge of cooperating under this environment is that the system is simultaneously, as you can imagine, standardized to the extent described above, but they are also competitive, as knowledge is, and more recognized as such, a strategic asset for societies. And this problem encompasses a heterogeneous view of societies, and therefore of the use of technology. We are left to see how decision makers, and in particular the academic leaders, may deal with these sources of tension, the standardization and the competitiveness. And that brings us to our final part, which is the conclusion, to discuss exactly this. So in conclusion, I will consider the role of leaders balancing culture and standardization. Let us go back to the nature of the LEAD project. At Lead2, we aim to develop academic leadership and discuss governance models of Chinese and European universities in the context of innovation and also of international cooperation. The idea of cooperation among universities, and in particular of international cooperation, requires to understand not only how like-minded but not necessarily comparable institutions immersed in distinct social realities with different working methods may converge in working together, converging different views of the world with the goal of delivering specific results, the services relevant for each of their societies, to their unique and potentially different stakeholders. We may illustrate these with two universities. University C for China, University E for Europe. China is financed by the government of China. Europe is financed by the Commission under the European Strategic Agenda. So each of them have to cooperate under a long-run project. In order to cooperate, both universities need to identify a number of things, how to justify the long-run interest of this cooperation, and a proper overlap in their different agendas that could justify such a cooperation. The level of internal organizational transformation that such cooperation would require from both sides. In this sense, standardization may be helpful, as both sides share a minimum common ground to work together, as for example, the technology with the online communication technology that we have just described is a very good example. But international standards of publication that are recognized by all of us, and the use of a common research language, typically in English. How helpful this standardization may look, it may be a curtain, right? As academic leaders are aware of the trade-off between these apparent facilitators and the obstacles of international cooperation. The key ingredient for a successful cooperation among international institutions lies on how these academic leadership is conscious that cultural and social differences are unavoidable as the key ingredient to answer the three main questions that I revise. How to justify the long-run interest of such cooperation, a proper overlap in the research strategic and institutional agendas that could justify this cooperation, and finally, the level of internal organization transformation that cooperating internationally will require from us. And I think that this is a quite good point to stop and think about these issues. Thank you very much for listening.